So last week we talked about how to diagnose diabetes, how to classify diabetes, and this week we'll move on to the management of diabetes. And the first session, which is today, we'll be looking at diabetic diet and physical activity. So I have discussed the statistics before also. Data from the US suggests that only 30% of type 2 diabetes achieve an A1C less than 9%. What that means is 70% of people have A1C which is greater than 9%. And if you think of patients who have good control, that is, who have A1Cs of 7% or lesser, the number of those patients is actually around only 10%. So only 10% of diabetic patients achieve an A1C of less than 7%. And we don't have large scale data from India, but Indian data could be worse because our healthcare delivery is poorer than that of the US. But even I have observed in my own practice and in my experience at other centers that on average only 1 out of 10 patients that I see seems to have a A1C which is less than 7%. And it seems to be the same everywhere. The percentage of patients with controlled diabetes at different diabetes centers appears to be the same. And there is logic to it also, because most places follow the similar treatment protocol, right? We all start off with metformin, then we add sulfonylurea or a DPP4. Maybe sometimes we might use SGLT2, and if nothing works, then we move on to insulin. So what is the issue? Why are patients not achieving glycemic control? One observation that some of you may also have seen, and of course we have see day in and day out, is that patients tend to fluctuate between good control and poor control on the very same treatment. You motivate them and send them back, they achieve a normal blood glucose, but they come back a few months later with a poor control. Then sometimes you have to admit some patients for some reason, they want to get a surgery done, or they say the blood glucose is not coming down. And after admitting those patients, the blood glucose corrects without even changing the treatment. On the same treatment, patients begin to get a normal blood glucose. And if you ask the 10% patients who achieve a normal A1C with treatment and try to ascertain what is the reason behind the good control, most of them agree on just one point, that they are very particular about diabetic diet. So the common link between all these three, having intermittent good control, achieving good control when you are admitted, and what difference does admission make? Once you get admitted, you are eating the hospital food, which is diabetic diet, right? So the common link between all these three is, of course, diabetic diet. So why is this happening, right? To understand this, you have to first look into the efficacy of oral drugs. If you look at different OHAs, the percentage reduction in A1C that you can achieve with a drug is less than 1%. Whether it is metformin or glimepiride or vildagliptin, even if you test the drug in trial setting, the A1C improvement with these drugs is less than 1%. For most drugs, it's around 0.7, 0.8, 0.9%. And mind you, this is in the trial settings. In the real world setting, you should not expect to see this. To give you an analogy, if you go and to buy a vehicle or a car and you ask the salesperson what is the mileage, he'll show you the company's pamphlet which says it mileage is 24 kilometers per liter. You're very impressed, you buy the car and you drive it yourself, and you find that in your experience the mileage is only 16 kilometers per liter. And you think that, okay, this company is a cheat, they told me it's 24 but it gives only 16. But the company is not lying, at least not in the technical sense, because they have tested the mileage under ideal circumstances. They took it on a racetrack with very good tires, they put in the best petrol, Then there was no traffic. They drove in the top gear. There was no braking at all. And they got the 24 value. But when you drove that car, you're driving it in traffic, you're driving in second gear, third gear, you're stopping and starting, your petrol is maybe not of the best quality, and the car is going to wear and tear, and you can't expect to get the same result. Similarly, if the trial says A1C reduction is 0.9%, you can be assured that in your practice, you will not achieve more than 0.7%, maybe even lesser. And furthermore, these values of less than 1% are those values which you get when you are using the drug as monotherapy. When the patient is already on an OHA, let's say patient is already taking metformin, and you add on glimepiride, you should not expect to see the same result had you added glimepiride in the first place. So as a monotherapy, let's say glimepiride gives you 0.9% reduction in A1C, but when the patient is already taking metformin and you add glimepiride, you will get a lesser value. Your reduction will be less than 0.9, maybe 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, it may be anything. And actually, if you add a third drug, the effect of the third drug will be even blunted further. The third drug will perform much below its potential as a monotherapy. So the message behind all this is that even if you go for 3 drugs to control diabetes, you should not expect to reduce your A1C by more than 1.5 or 1.6%. Because the first drug will do 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, the second will do another 0.7, the third will do 0.5 maybe, and you add them together, you're not going to go beyond 1.5, 1.6%. On the other hand, data suggests that if you follow diabetic diet strictly, you can reduce A1C by up to 2%. So diet alone can reduce A1C by 2%, whereas 3 drugs combined cannot reduce A1C by 2%. So this is the reason for what we were seeing earlier, that majority of patients are not getting controlled, and those who are controlled are doing only one thing different, they are following diabetic diet. So they are taking advantage of this 2%, and when that is combined with the OADs, they're able to achieve a normal blood glucose. Now think of it this way, somebody has a milder form of diabetes, their A1C is only 8. They are not following diabetic diet, but they are taking metformin. Because metformin can reduce 0.7, 0.8% A1C, they can get A1C of 7.2%, at least in the beginning. But as time goes by, diabetes will worsen. Diabetes is a chronic progressive disorder. It will worsen with time. So the same patient will then start to see an increase in the A1C. Then you will have to add a second drug and third drug. And down the line, he'll become uncontrolled because he is not following diabetic diet. And if your baseline A1C is, let's say, 10%, then it is obvious that he cannot achieve normal A1C without following diet. If that person does not stick to diabetic diet and if only takes OADs, we can even reduce it to 0.9% or 8.5%, but never 7%, right? Therefore, the impact of diet should not be ignored upon the A1Cs. I already talked about that is impossible to correct high A1C if you do not follow diet, right? Now, before we go into the depths of how diet is to be delivered, I want to just cover some basics. This is regarding type 2 diabetes. You look at the bottom panel, the dotted squares show insulin resistance, and this is the timeline. So year 0 is when diabetes begins. So in type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance appears around 10 to 15 years before the onset of diabetes, right? So if you develop diabetes at 30 years of age, that means your insulin resistance had begun at 15 years of age. And that is why talks of reversing diabetes are essentially nonsense, because it's not happened just now. It was happening all the last decade or more than a decade, right? So you can't just quickly reverse what has happened over a decade. And because of insulin resistance in the beginning, the beta cells try to compensate for the resistance by increasing insulin secretion. But a time comes after which the beta cells cannot produce so much insulin as is required to overcome the resistance. And then the beta cells begin to fail. And then as the secretion falls down, the blood glucose begins to rise. As you see in the upper panel, this is the blood glucose, which was normal in the initial part when there was high insulin levels and high insulin resistance. But as insulin levels fall, the blood glucose began to rise. And then as the disease progresses, the insulin secretion falls further and further. And then your blood glucose rises even more. And in the initial part, when the insulin secretion is still there, you can manage with OADs. But when the secretion becomes very low, then you are forced to add insulin to type 2 diabetes also. So this is the natural history of type 2 diabetes. Now, what is the relationship between meals and blood glucose? So these are normal people. When the person is fasting, the blood glucose is maintained around, let's say, 100 or 90. And then when they have the meal, they get a spike, right? When you eat food, this is the breakfast probably, blood glucose rises a little bit upwards, and then it falls back down to the normal. Then you have your lunch, again blood glucose rises a bit, and then again falls back to normal. Now in a normal person, these fluctuations or rises are within the normal range of blood glucose. But somebody with pre-diabetes, as you can see the upper line, will have a baseline value which is higher, and their peaks are a little taller. So you see a little taller peak, and then it struggles to come back to baseline, and there is again a tall peak. And of course, somebody with diabetes will have even higher baseline values and even taller peaks. So this is what happens when to blood glucose with meals. Now in this diagram, I want you to focus on this gray part. Don't look at the black lines. Just only focus on the gray part. So the patient is fasting early morning. That's 4 o'clock in the morning. Patient is fasting, and this is the insulin level on the y-axis. Insulin level is not 0. So even when you are fasting, there are some insulin that is being secreted by the pancreas, and this is your basal insulin secretion. Right now I'm talking about non-diabetic person. This person, I'm not talking about diabetic person, normal non-diabetic person, right? So even in the fasting state, there is some insulin secretion, and this insulin secretion is called basal insulin secretion. And this is responsible for maintaining the blood glucose in the normal range. Then once you have your meal, let's say this at around 8 o'clock, this person took the breakfast, the insulin secretion increased, and there was a peak in insulin secretion. Now, if you go back, this peak coincides with the increase in the blood glucose, which you saw in the previous graph. So blood glucose was rising, but the body does not want the glucose to rise really high. So it also increases the insulin secretion parallelly. So insulin secretion went up, blood glucose was controlled, and then as blood glucose started to begin to fall to normal levels, the insulin secretion rapidly fell down, and then it gradually fell down to the normal value, to the basal value. And similar thing happened for the lunch, and similar happened for the dinner. So you got your basal secretion, which happens all the time, and when you eat food, you get a prandial insulin secretion. Now, if you look a little deeper into the prandial insulin secretion, it's got two components. So basal, this is the basal. The prandial has actually a quick peak followed by a delayed peak. The first peak which occurs, the first peak which occurs is called first phase insulin response. First phase insulin response is the secretion of preformed insulin whenever you have your meal. And this counters the acute hyperglycemia, and subsequently the cells, beta cells, produce more insulin later on as you eat the meal, and this is the second phase response. So in type 2 diabetes, there are two abnormalities. Number one, the basal effect, insulin effect is reduced. Although the absolute levels of insulin are high, the effect of basal insulin is reduced because of insulin resistance. And secondly, with respect to the prandial insulin secretion, not only is the increase in insulin secretion diminished, it is also delayed. So in terms of percentage increase in the secretion of insulin as compared to baseline, diabetics secrete less amount of insulin, and the first phase response is blunted, and so they end up secreting insulin at a later period. So this is called loss of first phase response and exaggerated second phase response. So these are the abnormalities that occur in diabetes. Now we'll move on to diabetic diet and look at the components of diabetic diet. So when you are talking about diabetic diet, it's not just about not eating aloo and not eating chawal, because that is the advice which your neighboring auntie would give you, and that is the advice which everybody in India seems to be throwing around at each other. Diabetic diet has got several components, and basically you're asking three questions. When to eat, that is when should I eat food, what to eat, and third is how much to eat. Unfortunately, all the focus seems to be on what to eat and what not to eat. But the other two questions are equally, if not more important. Let's begin with when to eat. So the answer to when to eat is that a diabetic diet should be a 3+3 meal pattern. and I'll show you what I mean by 3+3. So the first 3 is your major meals. That is breakfast, which should be around 8 to 9 o'clock. Lunch, which should be around 1 to 2 in the afternoon. And dinner, which should be around 8 to 9 at bedtime. This is the first 3. Then the second 3 are the mid-meal snacks. So in between breakfast and lunch, you take a mid-morning snack at around 11 a.m. Between lunch and dinner, you take your evening snack, which is at 4 to 5 p.m. And before going to bed, that is 2 hours post dinner, you take your bedtime snack. So this is the 3+3 meal pattern. So this 3+3 meal pattern gives you a lower blood glucose for the same amount of food consumed. Why? Because less food per meal will give you a lesser rise in blood sugar. So let's look at it in a simplistic way. Let's say this is a diabetic patient and this is the threshold of hyperglycemia. Now the patient on the top is taking 3 meals, 3 meal pattern with 1800 kilocalories total consumed. So there are 3 spikes. This is the breakfast spike, this is the lunch spike, and the dinner spike. On all 3 occasions, you see blood glucose is shooting up and crossing the hyperglycemia threshold and then gradually coming back to normal. It happens in all the 3 times. Now if you take a 3+3 meal pattern, that is the lower panel, you've got 3 peaks of the main which are shorter because you've reduced some amount of food from here and put them as a mid-meal snacks. So you get 3 peaks which are shorter and therefore they remain within the glycemic threshold. And then of course you've got the smaller peaks with the meals which anyway would not cross the threshold. So the rationale behind this is that, as we discussed, in type 2 diabetes, the prandial response is delayed and decreased. But if you reduce the caloric load, that delayed response and decreased response may be enough to maintain euglycemia. And this is especially true in the early part of diabetes, in the early phases of type 2 diabetes, when the insulin secretion is not completely lost. So therefore, in such patients, just by rearranging the meal in a 3+3 pattern, you can reduce blood glucose without even cutting down on the amount of food the patient is eating. So it is very simple, very intuitive, makes perfect sense. But unfortunately, people do not follow this and they land up with a lot of hyperglycemia. The second advantage is, of course, we discussed this. In simple terms, you can say the body can deal with small meals better, but I've explained to you how the secretion changes in type 2 diabetes, the prandial secretion, and how these smaller meals are beneficial. Then there are some other behavioral advantages of 3+3 pattern. Number 1 is that if you take a snack, then you are not hungry, and that prevents you from overeating. And you would have seen this yourself even in your own body. If you don't eat for a long time and then you suddenly given food, you end up eating a lot more than you intended to eat. But on the contrary, if you've been eating a little bit throughout the day, you don't feel particularly hungry and you don't overeat. So if you take, let's say, evening snack, you will not be particularly hungry at dinner, and you will be able to eat the usual amount rather than overeat. And because you will not overeat, your blood glucose is likely to remain lower than otherwise. And lastly, if you're taking a planned snack, let's say at 4 o'clock in the evening, you had a glass of milk, which was your planned snack. At 5 o'clock, if somebody offers you a samosa to eat, then you would not feel like eating because you're already full. But had you not had any snack, you would be hungry, and then you would be tempted to take that food, knowing, although you know that it is not good for you, you should not be eating, but the temptation overcomes you when you are hungry and you end up eating it. But if you are already full, then you are less likely to yield to temptation. So this is a behavioral advantage of having a 3+3 pattern. Now the 3+3 pattern is critical for patients who are on insulin. And now I'm going to show you the same diagram, but now I want you to focus on the black lines. The black lines represent the basal bolus regimen. As you would have guessed, this dark black line at the bottom is your long-acting insulin, let's say Glargine, which is providing you the basal cover. It is trying to make the basal secretion. And at the time of meal, we give you these arrows. These are injections of Lispro or some other short-acting insulin, which are coinciding with the meal. And this is the action profile of the short-acting insulin. So it goes up, has a peak, and then comes down. So we're trying to mimic a physiological secretion. But actually, we are not able to do that, because if you look closely, the movement of the natural secretion is a little more acute. It rises more rapidly and then falls very rapidly. This is because the body is doing this in real time. The body is looking at the blood glucose, it is changing the secretion of insulin because it is being secreted in real time. But when you're giving an injection, you've already given the full dose. That 12 units or 10 units that you've given is going to get absorbed. It's going to have a peak at 1 hour. It's going to last for 4 hours. It's not going to change its value depending on the blood glucose. And because this exogenous insulin lasts for up to 4 hours, it is possible that the insulin continues to act even when the meal has been absorbed. So therefore, there is a risk of hypoglycemia 3 to 4 hours after you've taken your food or taken your injection with the insulin regimen, because the insulin injection has not completely removed itself from the circulation, whereas the blood glucose has already become normal. And if those patients take the mid-meal snack, it will prevent them from going into hypoglycemia. But if they don't take the snack, then they are completely undefended, and at that point of time, they can go into hypoglycemia. And this is especially true for type 1 diabetes. This is a very common problem in type 1 diabetes. But even in type 2 patients who are taking insulin, this is something which has to be taken into consideration. Then we come to the second question, which is how much to eat. So this means essentially calculating the amount of calories the patient should be getting. Now the calorie content depends upon several things. It depends on your BMI, your kind of work that you do, and the build of your body. We will not go into details of how that is calculated because it's a little complex and not particularly useful in the general context. But basically, we have got a calorie calculator which has got all the formulas fed in, and we use this in our department to calculate the calorie content. But just to give you an idea, you need to fill in the sex, you need to fill in the build, whether the patient is a small build, heavy build, or moderate build, and whether it's a sedentary worker or a heavy worker or a moderate worker. Somebody who is a laborer is a heavy worker, somebody who does mild labor work is a moderate worker, and somebody who's completely sitting is a sedentary worker. Then you put in your weight and height. Then the calculator will calculate the ideal body weight, and then it will look at the BMI status, and accordingly it will adjust the calories and they'll give you a caloric output. So this is the calorie requirement for a person as it is. But if the person is diabetic and is overweight or obese, then such patients need to lose at least 5 to 10% of body weight to achieve good control. And therefore, you may want to subtract 500 to 1000 calories from the value that you get from the calculator to come out with the final calorie for the patient. But just as a broad idea, if you don't have access to a proper dietitian who can do this for you, you can take it as a rule of thumb that for the average size sedentary females, around 1400 to 1600 calories is the kind of diet we prescribe, and for males it is 1600 to 1800. So importantly, average is put in quotes because if the patient is really obese, then you might want to have lower calories. If the patient is really tall, then you might have to give more calories. So this is just a rule of thumb, but ideally patient should go to a dietitian who should calculate their calories and then tell you how much to take. But usually we end up with using these values which are mentioned here. Then second component of how much to eat is portion sizes. You're using a utensil at home. Is that utensil a katori or is it a katora? What I mean by this is you look at these two, both of them can be called katoris. So patient A may be having this katori at home and patient B may be having this other katori at home. Now this katori is roughly around 120 ml of fluid, whereas the other one is almost 250. So this katori is double of that katori. So if you're using this katori at home, you'll tell the dietitian, okay, I'm also taking 1 katori dal, but actually you're consuming double the calories. So it is very important for the dietitian to communicate to the patient that you've got to consume this amount of food and this is the size of utensil. Ideally, the patient should bring his utensil to the dietitian and show them this is my katori, this is my bowl, so that they know how much to eat. So a lot of patients end up overeating because they're using large utensils. Similarly, how big is your roti? Normally the roti that the dietitian prescribes is a 25-gram flour roti, but somebody could be eating a very large roti which is bigger in circumference, or a very thick roti which has 50 grams of flour. So obviously you're going to end up with double calories. Then there are some people who will say, Dr. Saab, सूखी रोटी तो नहीं खाई जाती, हम तो थोड़ा सा घी लगा लेते हैं. That thoda sa ghee goes a long way. If you use around 2 teaspoon of ghee throughout the day for putting on your rotis, then you are getting around 10 grams of ghee. 10 grams of ghee into 365 days, that is 1 year, multiplied by 10 years, will lead you to gain 36 kgs in weight. Of course, maybe this is not a perfect calculation. Maybe you'll not gain 10 grams from 2 TS of ghee. Maybe you'll get 7 grams or 6 grams. But still, look at the amount of weight gain that will occur in 10 years. And then people say that, I don't know how I gained weight. This is how you gain weight. You eating ghee with your rotis, right? As you say, every drop counts in the ocean. So most of us are eating a lot more than we should. But if you're not diabetic, then it's only obesity. But for diabetics, it means poor glycemic control. Then comes to the question of what to eat and what not to eat. Carbohydrates. So you're supposed to restrict carbohydrates to 45 to 50% of the total caloric intake. And if possible, it should be even lower, but it is difficult to do. Simple carbs such as sugar or sugar-sweetened beverages such as colas, soft drinks should be avoided. Again, refined carbohydrates such as breads, biscuits, etc. also are not good. Starchy vegetables such as potatoes again should be avoided. And you should prefer complex carbohydrates such as roti or other carbohydrates. You've got jowar and bajra and those things. Then proteins, you're supposed to take at least 15 to 20 grams of percent of the calories as proteins, which translates to around 1 to 1.5 gram per kg protein in diabetic patients who don't have CKD, and around 0.8 grams per kg for those who have CKD. And then fat should be the remaining portion, and you should avoid trans fats, and you should reduce content of saturated fats but take more of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So these are the recommendations for the diet. But this is easier said than done, because for most of the vegetarian population, the pulses are the main source of protein, and even the pulses are 60% carbohydrates. If you take roti or flour, it is 70 to 80% carbohydrate, but even the pulses are 60% carbohydrate. So most of the Indian diets are actually very rich in carbohydrates and very poor in protein. Then this is about the main meals. We talked about the snacks, the mid-meal snacks. What should be taken in the snacks? You can take either bhuna chana, 25 grams, so you can take sprouts, the same amount. You can go for a single fruit, which should be at least 100 grams of size or lesser. You can take boiled egg whites, or you can take 200 ml of milk. So these are the options for the mid-meal snacks. Most Indian diets use a mixture of diet charts rather use a mixture of roti, dal, and sabzi for the main meals, and they omit rice and they omit meats. That's in North India. In South India, probably they may be consuming some amount of rice, although rice is supposed to be high glycemic index and supposed to have a poorer outcome. But diabetes in North India is as worse as that in South India. So I don't know really what is the practical merit behind that argument. But still, glycemic index of rice is more than that of wheat. So probably wheat is preferable. So this is like what a diet chart looks like. It mentions the various meals, the timing of the meals, and then what all foods is supposed to take, the quantities mentioned. So this is how the diet chart is given to the patient. And unfortunately, most patients don't even bother to read it, or let alone follow it. And then it also mentions something about what fruits you can eat. So there's a common question: can I eat fruits? Which fruit should I eat? So apparently, you can eat apple, papita, jamun, amrut, mosmi, santra, kharbuza. These are the fruits which you can eat, and fruits which are a little more sweet, such as mango and banana, should be avoided. But again, if you consume in the correct amount, let's say you take less than 100 grams of mango, it's not going to wreak havoc on the blood glucose. But what people do is they end up eating 500 grams or kg of mango, and then the blood glucose becomes poor. Then just wanted to sensitize you about the amount of calories that there are in common foods. A 25 gram flour roti will have around 85 calories, whereas rice will have 120 calories for 1 cup. Dal is around 100 grams. But look at oil. 2 TSF of oil or ghee will have 90 calories. You know, fats are really calorie dense. Then you've got tea, which is around 70 calories. And this is often not counted. People are taking 4 or 5 cups of tea in a day, and they say that, okay, I'm only taking 1600 calories. I don't know why my blood glucose is not going down. But boss, you're taking 350 calories as tea. You're not adding that. So you're actually taking 2000 calories. Barfi, small piece is 140 calories. Is a lot more than roti and rice. Biscuits, which are supposedly innocuous, are actually 30 to 50 calories per biscuit. So couple of biscuits can be more than 1 roti. And samosa, deep fried, it's got 308 calories. So that is equal to taking 4 chapatis in 1 go. And you can't eat 4 chapatis in one go, but you can eat one samosa. And it's going to really increase your caloric intake, and it's going to make your blood glucose shoot through the roof. Chole bhature is the absolute king. It has got 450 calories, deep fried, lot of oil. So diabetic patients are consuming all of these, and they need to be sensitized that the amount of calories that you are consuming from these foods is huge, and there is no way your OADs or even insulin are going to match up to the amount of calories that you are eating. So unless they go and control all this, stop eating all this junk, it's unlikely for them to get a normal blood glucose. And that is the reason why 70% of them have A1Cs 9% and higher. Then there is a lot of talk about fad diets. Fad diets is basically all the newfangled ideas. You have got a paleo diet and the keto diet, very low carbohydrate diet, and all those things. In general, fad diets supposed to be avoided in diabetes. You're not supposed to take low calorie diets because you might end up with hypoglycemia. Again, keto diets can lead you to ketoacidosis and so on and so forth. They can be employed in obesity and prediabetes. But the problem with fad diets is this. This is the story of the tortoise and the hare. So the fad diet is your hare. It runs very fast. You can get very quick results with the fad diet. But the problem is that you can't continue that fad diet forever. You can't stop eating carbohydrate forever. You can stop it for a few months, but eventually you will again stop, give up your diet and eat normally, and you will reverse whatever benefits you've got from it. On the other hand, if you do something consistently, like a tortoise, for example, the diabetic diet that we are talking about, which is quite simple, it's just multiple small meals throughout the day, you are more likely to continue with it and more likely to get benefits out of it. So that will be all about diet. And now we'll move to the portion on physical activity. So what are the benefits of physical activity? Number one, in terms of A1C reduction, you can reduce A1C by 0.7%. So physical activity alone is as good as any of the OADs that you are taking. So if you do a combination of diet and physical activity, you can reduce A1C by 2.7%. And that is, I think, what will control blood glucose for most of the people. And these benefits of exercise come from just exercise alone. It doesn't even take into account the change in BMI, right? If you do exercise regularly, you're going to lower your BMI, you're going to lose fat, and that is going to have additional benefits in terms of blood glucose. You get additional benefits in the weight, in the waist circumference, in the lipid profile, in hypertension. So the benefits are much more beyond the glycemic improvement. Patients who regularly exercise have reduced cardiovascular mortality, and they also have reduced all-cause mortality. So there are multiple reasons for a patient to engage in physical activity. But then comes the question, what is the physical activity that we are supposed to do? And generally you tell the patient, morning walk kar lena. It's not that simple. So first of all, let's look at physical activity recommendations. The recommendation is more than 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week. Okay. It should be done over at least 3 days per week with no consecutive 2 days without activity. That means that at least if you want to do 150 minutes, you can do 50 minutes per day for 3 days. But it's not, should not be like you did for first 3 weeks and 3 days, and then remaining 4 days you did nothing. So you can't miss 2 days without exercise, and you can either do 25 minutes every day or you can do 50 for 3 days. There should be 2 to 3 sessions per week of resistance exercise. That is some weight lifting or that sort of exercise. And you should avoid prolonged sitting for more than 30 minutes. So these are the recommendations for physical activity. Now comes the question, recommendation was moderate and vigorous physical activity. So what do you mean by moderate and vigorous physical activity? So WHO tells you that moderate physical activity is that activity which uses 3 to 6 METs, whereas vigorous activity is more than 6 METs. Examples of moderate intensity exercise are brisk walking, dancing, gardening, whereas that of vigorous exercise are running, walking, etc. But then the question is, how brisk is brisk? You tell the patient, do a brisk walk, but what do you mean by brisk walk? My mother-in-law covers 1 kilometer in 1 month. my son does 1 kilometer in 7 minutes. So I am brisker than my mother-in-law, but I am not as brisk as my son. What does brisk mean? So first, let's talk about the scientific component. What does METs mean? So METs means metabolic equivalent of task. It is the amount of oxygen consumed while sitting at rest. And for the usual person, it is around 3.5 milliliter of oxygen per kg per minute. So 1 MET is the energy used when you're sitting or resting or sitting still. And activity of 4 METs means you're using 4 times the energy used sitting still. Now to measure METs, you need to measure the amount of oxygen consumed, and it is not something that you can do in the OPD. Only you can do that only in research setting. So this is not a practical way of defining activity. You can't tell the patient ki 4 METs karke aana hai aapko. The other definition, which is a little bit less technical but still difficult to do, is the maximal heart rate method. Maximal heart rate method says that maximal heart rate for a person is 220 minus h. And moderate intensity activity is when you are achieving 65 to 75% of maximal heart rate. And vigorous intensity is when you are achieving 79 to 93% maximal heart rate. And as an example, if you are 50-year-old, maximal heart rate is 170 beats and moderate is 170 beats per minute. So moderate activity will be 65 to 75% of that. That means 110 to 127 beats per minute. So if you can measure the heart rate while you're doing the activity, then you can target what is moderate and what is vigorous. But still, these methods are still not practical. You can't tell the patient to count the heart rate. Not everybody will be able to do that. So there are some crude methods. One crude method is telling the patient that for an average size person, he should be covering at least 3 kilometers in 30 minutes. But again, somebody who's short on height may not have the same gait length of stride, and therefore they may not be able to do the same distance. But roughly speaking, at least 3 kilometers in 30 minutes. The second method, which is the one I call the conversation method. So what does conversation method mean? It says that if you can have a conversation while you are walking, that means you are doing only mild physical activity. If you can only answer the person in short phrases, that you're walking with somebody is asking you a question and you can only answer not in full sentence, but you can only talk in short phrases, then that means you're doing a moderate physical activity. On the other hand, if you're not able to talk or you can generally just say a few words, that means you're doing vigorous physical activity. So this is a practical way of defining physical activity. So this is how you can tell the patient that this is the kind of intensity with which you have to do your physical activity. There's some risk of physical activity. Patients who are predisposed to hypoglycemia, such as type 1 diabetes, can go into hypoglycemia. So they need to check blood glucose prior to the exercise. And if it is less than 150, then they should take a snack. And if the patient is type 2 diabetes, he may be at risk for CV disease. So then we need to screen them for CV disease and manage for risk factors. And they should start with a slower activity. So I think I'll stop here because we're running out of time and go into the next session to finish off the component of physical activity. So some practical tips for the patient. They should be keeping a fixed time in their schedule for exercise, because if that is variable, then it generally does not get done. What is the best time to do the activity? Well, if you can do in the morning, then that is probably the best, but basically any time is better than no time. You can even do in the evening. Easiest exercise is a brisk walk or a jog. As we discussed, 3 kilometers in 30 minutes is a standard answer. And if you're not accustomed to activity, then you can start with a brisk walk for 2 minutes, then a slow walk for 1 minute, and then again brisk, and do this for 30 minutes. And if you keep on doing this day in and day after day, then over a few weeks, you can build up to brisk walk for 30 minutes. And then again, this is the same which we discussed. If you have heart disease or you think that you have heart disease, then you need to, check with the doctor. You should not, it's important not to take your insulin or tablet, that is OADs, just before the exercise, because then the risk of hypoglycemia will be even more increased. And if the blood glucose is less than 150, then you need to take a snack. And it may be a good idea to carry glucose tablets or hard candy to consume if you get low blood glucose. So now we come to the summary. Diabetic diet is the single most important management component, and it is also the most ignored component. save perhaps exercise. And because of this reason, most patients with type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes do not achieve euglycemia. And it is the paradox is that even not just the patients, even the physicians who are treating them are also not aware that it is the diabetic diet which is the more important component, and the focus always remains upon which OAD to give or how much insulin to give, without looking at what the patient is eating, when they're eating. And unless we really look into how they're eating, when they're eating, how much they're eating, we're not going to get anything done in terms of the blood glucose. And this is especially when the patients are on insulin, then it is almost impossible to control the blood glucose if they are not eating in the right way. So basically 3+3 meal patterns with the correct timing is important. You should get the calorie calculation done and get a tailored diet chart from the dietitian, which is quantity of food according to your body weight and physical activity. You need to ensure the correct compliance in terms of portion sizes. If you're using too big utensils, then you'll eat more food. Avoid high calorie foods. Then physical activity is not just morning walk. If you just stroll in the park in the morning, that is not activity. There's not going to be much benefit out of it. You need to estimate the intensity of the activity and guide the patient that what is the proper activity they should be doing. And you must be careful about hypoglycemia. So that will be the end of this presentation on diabetic diet and exercise.